Hi, everyone. My name is Asim Chandra, your host today for the RevSignal podcast series, co-founder and CEO at Immersa.ai. I'm joined today by our guest, Nate Sooter from Smartsheets, and really excited for this conversation that's coming up. For those of you who've been following our series for a while, you know that we are trying to understand the problem around how to take signals out of product data, out of your CRM data, and enable your GTM teams with that data. So we're exploring that problem from different directions. You've heard us meet with a number of customer success people. In the past, we've talked to product owners that own the data in their teams. We're now excited to have Nate talk to us a little bit about how data teams tend to think about that problem from a business operations lens. So Nate, welcome to the show, and it's great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're dialed in from.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat data. I'm always down for that. So I'm Nate. I work at Smartsheet now. I've been there in the past. I actually just rejoined Smartsheet recently. In between, I was at a small CRM named Insightly. So I've been doing data for a while now, about 10 years. I live a little north of Seattle with 2 little kids. You might hear little kid noises running around the background. That's just life, kind of working from home, doing webinars from home. So I've been doing data for a while and just love, especially go-to-market teams. I started as a customer success and CS rep in SaaS before this. So love the go-to-market team and data side. Excited to chat.
Yeah, I think maybe take a minute. I know in terms of your background, you started out in customer success, maybe a little bit of sales as well. Your first day of work at Funko, was it? Was the first company that you worked for?
Funko was the first company where I did data for them. Yeah. So before that, I was CS, but I ended up at Funko. If anyone's familiar with them, they make little collectible pop figurines you can buy at Barnes & Noble and other stores. But yeah, started data there.
Got it. So how did you get into the world of data from CS? What did that look like for you?
That's such a good question. It's a hard transition. Even, we're talking 2013, 2014, I learned about what data was. Before that, I was doing customer success for Rosetta Stone, funny enough, the language learning company, working with some of their enterprise customers, and realized I was doing data tasks without knowing that data was a career, if that makes sense. I think I've met, you're doing data and you say, I'm actually making reports and dashboards, and I found another data person who said, this is a career, you can do this. And so I tried to find my way into it and kept getting rejected as I applied to various companies because I didn't have experience. This is like a lot of data, people want to get in, they don't have experience. And I ran into that same exact wall. People would say, your resume looks great for sales. How about this role? I kept getting redirected. Eventually found someone at Funko that was willing to take a risk on me doing half-time data and half-time something else. They said, prove yourself with data, we'll give you full-time data. So I eventually found that role, got connected into data that way.
Awesome. And I'm actually, I'd love to hear a little bit about Funko. Like, what was your role there from a data standpoint? And that's such a fun little company. So maybe talk a little bit about that and what kind of data problems you were trying to solve for them.
Yeah, this was I call it my data master's degree. It was a company growing incredibly fast at the time. This is before, it wasn't really a household name when I joined. So there was people doing plenty of data work, but there wasn't really someone dedicated especially the go-to-market team, providing reports to people on that side. So I was hired in to help with I was reporting into the sales team and figuring that out. But that was certainly called my master's degree because I didn't really know SQL. I'd read a book, but I hadn't built a database, figured out how to calculate royalties, all these things that happen with products, like ordering products. How do you know how many are on order? How many we should order? Getting into those kinds of questions. So really operationally heavy pieces that happen with a company shipping physical goods. It's very different than SaaS, where you can ship a bunch of goods just by typing a number in, and now you have 10,000 licenses. Very different with physical products.
Right.
And so supply chain analytics. So I learned a lot. I basically learned how to make databases, create reports for people, make it so that operations were more obvious to sales reps, that kind of thing. I really learned, it was 2 years of very intense work, learning with a very steep learning curve, a lot of mistakes, but I came out of it with a lot of learning.
Fantastic. So I know, after that you were at Smartsheets, and you went to Insightly, and now you're back at Smartsheets. We'll talk about Smartsheets in a bit, but I'm curious to learn a little bit more about Insightly. They are a CRM solution. Where do they fit in the market relative to, say, HubSpot or Salesforce, and a little bit about your role there?
Yeah, so Insightly is in the CRM market. They compete typically for smaller employee bands, like Salesforce is kind of the enterprise solution, HubSpot to some extent, but it's pretty common for Insight to compete with HubSpot for the kind of middle market or SMB space. So that's where it really fits in the market well there. They have a great tool set that brings a few different tools like your kind of Marketo or marketing automation together with it, along with ways to connect APIs together with a thing they call App Connect. So they kind of make it so a smaller team can operate a CRM. And so that's really where they operate in the market. And so I joined there to run all of data. They had some analytics that had happened. They had Tableau stood up at one point that had gone away. They had Metabase stood up at one point. They had a Snowflake database that some people used, but not really organized. And so I joined on the go-to-market team reporting to the CSO and took over all the analytics there. So I was really getting all the sales analytics for the different sales teams lined up, and how do we track, renewals? How do we track new business sales? All that kind of key metric stuff is what I helped build out over the last year or so.
Got it. So just to confirm my understanding here, first person with a sort of focused role on data, enabling the sales team, reporting into the CRO, and sort of helping them get all that metrics, et cetera, set up for tracking how they're performing. Tell us a little bit about the data infrastructure that you built out. And I think probably more importantly, the rationale for the sequence in which you went about it, right? So let's start with that, just trying to understand the different tools, what they do, and why did you choose to go with that, and what's the sequence in which you sort of made those choices?
Yeah, great question. So the company already had some pieces in place that kind of set where I went from there. So they had Snowflake, and they had a software engineer working on, or a DBA that was working on the production database, kind of on his part-time putting things into Snowflake. So we had that world. And so I had Snowflake to operate with, and I built some solutions at Smartsheet around like, what tools do we use to transform raw data in Snowflake into usable data in a dashboard? But there wasn't anything in place. They had just, here's a Snowflake database, go find tools. And so I had a few options, which was go and find some cloud providers. And like, Fivetran would let me bring data into Snowflake. dbt Cloud would let me run it and transform data. So I had some cloud choices. I actually ran into a company that packages together open source software together into one spot for me to use for all those different steps. So the name is Datacos. It's a small company. Met them on the dbt Slack, but they package together Airbyte and Airflow and dbt and let me run them in a small package. And it's all in one spot, as well as VS Code. I could do all my coding in the cloud as well. So for a team of one, I needed a tool that would use it. And I was looking around, and instead of buying a bunch of cloud providers, I found someone who packaged those open source pieces together.
Gotcha.
And so the decision for all the tools was kind of all in one, because then I had all the different pieces I needed for the modern kind of data piece.
Got it. So Nate, I mean, in this case, as you're sort of one man team, and leading the charge and sort of building out the data infrastructure from scratch, other than the fact that Snowflake was already in place. What are some of the challenges that you encountered along the way in terms of figuring out how to connect all these different pieces, how to make it all work? What are some of the common issues that you expect that people might encounter?
So I'm sure anyone who's dealt with CRM data has experienced this, but data cleanliness was a big issue. Like, I want to figure out things as simple as how much is an opportunity worth at a moment in time that you have in your CRM. Even that wasn't necessarily obvious. So it was a very typical challenge of saying, I want these metrics. So I kind of knew the metrics I wanted. I've done go-to-market metrics quite often, did them for a long time at Smartsheet as well and at Funko. So I knew what I wanted, but finding it was a big challenge. And then cleaning it was another. Like, the date would come into Snowflake, but it was a string format. Like, it wasn't the format I needed. So figuring out how to turn stuff into usable data. I spent time that no one really cares about me spending, right? Like, you have to kind of be in the salt mines a little bit and go and turn everything. Like, take that business logic was a hard part of it and get that figured out. And all just the different data formatting, making sure you have the right data, like finding where it was I was hunting through anyone who's changed jobs has experienced trying to find data somewhere where they're learning a new database. So there's a lot of that time learning where data was and finding out in whose head was the logic I needed to put into SQL so I could make a report for like a CEO like yourself, right? That was a lot of it. So that was a lot of my time was spent doing that business logic gathering piece.
Got it. So I think that right there is an interesting challenge that we see in the industry quite a bit, where data analysts and business analysts or experts at data and how to put all these different tools together and write, queries, et cetera, in SQL. You have to draw out the business logic from the business side, right? So, whereas the business side, they understand the context of the business and what metrics they need to track their performance and whatnot, but don't necessarily have the tools to figure out, how to ask the questions in the tools that you're building. So, how do you, obviously in Sightly context where it's, you're one or two people, part of the field organization kind of supporting them directly, you probably get a lot of exposure to the business context. But more broadly, as you look across the industry, do you see a challenge there? Do you see an opportunity there?
Yeah, there's always this is where I think really good data workers separate themselves from kind of the average data worker, honestly, is those who are really good tend to get excellent business context, especially on the analytics side. Like if you're business facing and you don't have good business context, you really struggle. You become like a ticket taker. You just do really basic tasks, and you get assigned the stuff no one else really wants to do, because you're not viewed as a strategic partner. You don't understand the CS org, or you don't understand the product org, or whatever it is, and you get kind of relegated to uninteresting work. So I really see that as a superpower, especially for if you're a small team like I was at Sightly. I couldn't just spend all my time bringing data into Snowflake. I had to actually get it out to the rest of the team. When you get bigger teams, there's a bit of a separation. Like there can be a data engineering team that is more platform oriented, like make sure Snowflake is always running, that different data is coming in reliably. Like there's pieces you can focus on that aren't business focused. But those are pretty specific to kind of larger companies with a data engineering focused team. Other than that, if you're at all stakeholder facing, analytics engineer, data analyst, machine learning, data science, whatever it is, you better really know your business domain. That makes you really stand out, and it helps your career go when you don't get relegated to those kind of ticket-taking tasks.
Makes sense. You mentioned a few different roles there in the context of a data team. Just take a moment to explain what each one of those does.
Yeah, and some of it depends on the company, but there's kind of overarching ways that these are viewed. So you typically have, if this is a bigger one, and this is what when we had similar at Smartsheet and at other companies, as I've talked to data workers, this is general structure. So data engineers are typically responsible for setting up a database like Snowflake, or I should say a data warehouse, like where you're going to pool your data from your CRM, from your marketing automation tool, from your product, from NetSuite or whatever those billing tools are into one place. So data engineers are responsible for gathering all that data into one place, making sure that place is reliable, that it's always working. Access is restricted properly. You need to start doing that at a certain point. So data engineers bring the data in. You can have people called analytics engineers, which is a newer title. They use tools like dbt, which we might get into a little later, but they take that raw data and enrich it. They kind of turn it from raw ore into kind of, here's a gold bar of data about your customers or whatever. So they enrich the data. And then you have data analysts and data scientists are typically the ones who are then business facing. They take that enriched data and they work with it to build models, or maybe they're just, helping count things. I've learned counting things is hard. So they help count things and show those dashboards to stakeholders. So that's the customer facing. You have machine learning engineers. They're kind of almost software engineering, helping things in the actual product. So that's a different role, but
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So, a lot of different tooling, a lot of different roles, a lot of complexity really around the data flows from where it originates as raw data to where it ends up in some form that's consumable by business users. Mm-hmm. Often that consumption occurs through dashboards, right? So, tell me a little bit about that. What's your take on dashboards and just in terms of like enabling business users with data? What are some of the different ways in which people think about it? What role do dashboards play in that context?
Yeah, dashboards are good in very specific cases, and I think they're overused in a lot of others in a lot of businesses. I think a lot of folks listening, if they've been served dashboards, have been frustrated with the dashboard doesn't have what I need, it's slow to adjust. So dashboards, in very specific cases, very handy. Like, how's the business operating? Are there any errors happening? And some kind of there's ways you can use them really effectively. I think dashboards are good when it's kind of when they drive an action is really what it needs to be. Like, just looking at something is fine, but if you think about your car dashboard, it tells you the speed you're going. Do I need to get gas or not? It tells you different pieces of information as you're driving, but all of it tells you what you should do. Should I slow down? Should I speed up? Should I pull over? Whatever it might be. The dashboards that are most effective drive actions for folks, and those are rare. Usually you have dashboards that I can't tell you how many times I've seen a dashboard presented and someone looks at it and says, okay, analyst, what should I do? Like this has lots of numbers, what should I be doing? So dashboards are pretty ineffective, I think, at that. Some can be good that way. I found myself erring away from those typically. Like they're good for showing status reports for a manager, but I always want to drive them out of the dashboard back somewhere else is really my design principle. I did it a lot at Insightly, where, for instance, a manager would say, I have all my opportunities of all my reps. So I would show them which are stale and which are not, and kind of define like what is a stale opportunity. But I would say, here's a link, go click out to it. Like go talk to the rep about this one, or you can see the list of 10 of them. Bring this up in your meeting and talk to them about those opportunities. So the dashboards really need to drive actions, and a lot of times they're just kind of statically sitting there. And so I think they're overused and misused for that reason. They need to be driving what to do.
Yeah. And I think that was a bit of a setup question because it kind of effectively defines why Immersa exists in the first place. Is we find there's a lot of data that is available to companies, but how do you actually turn that into actions that are helping run the business and drive the business in a better direction? That's kind of where we focus. So coming back to the discussion we're having. So this is, when you look at all this complexity and lots of different tools, lots of different roles, and certainly like as organizations scale, and we'll talk about Smartsheet in a minute because it's on 20x the scale of what you're describing here. Those roles start to evolve and specialize and such. So how do you justify the ROI for making these kinds of investments? Like, what are some of the ways that people from a data team perspective think about it and say, I'm going to have to go buy this, or I'm going to have to buy this other tool, I'm going to have to connect these things, I'm going to have to put people against it. How do you justify the ROI and all that investment?
Yeah, and some of it's obvious and some of it isn't obvious about how to justify it. So some of it can be. So some of the tools I've worked on say, hey, listen, all of our analysts are spending 10 hours a week wasting time munging data, or end stakeholders are munging stuff, and you can explain some time loss happening from some people who should be spending that 10 hours differently. So I think sometimes you can find wasted time. I've done that in the past, and identify if we do this, then there'll be much less wasted time by these folks. And some of it as well, in terms of ROI, it's funny, is you have to speak to the pain that different stakeholders are experiencing about data. That's really, I think, where some of the most effective ROI discussions I've seen is people say, I'm struggling, I'm on marketing. I do not care about your data platform. I just want to get the data I need right now. Or the product team says, we need to be able to analyze this quickly. And so I don't really care what your platform is. Like, explain to me how you're going to make this faster. And so that's a lot of the ROI discussions I've seen is, if you're doing your job well, then people say, we need to invest more in this team because they're getting us the stuff that we need and they are attentive to our business. This is where the business acumen piece of things is really handy for data teams. You have to be able to partner strategically with that team. And then they'll say, yes, they need more investment because we need 2 more analysts who are doing exactly what this person is doing. We just have more people we need to do this. Or, we need this tool that will help us ingest all of our product data and we'll be able to analyze it faster. So I found a lot of it is time savings as well as pain. You're helping assuage the pain of different stakeholders, are really where the ROI discussions have sat.
Got it. And the pain really, I heard you just say that maybe, but confirm that for me, but the pain is usually coming from the business direction, right? Like there's somebody on the business side that needs some information and it's important for them in order to run the business. So the urgency and the pain originates in that area. Is that fair?
Yeah, it really is from the business side. They're not able to self-serve stuff as much as they wish to. I think we're moving that way. There's a lot of self-serve work happening to make it that way, but it's not easy. It's very much, you have to know the business, especially if you're a central data team, you have to kind of know that business to know how to get them what they need. But yeah, the pain is coming from the business who can't get data. I mean, I was on calls with executives where, it'd say, and this is at multiple places, but they say, I asked a question on Monday and I don't get an answer till a week later. I don't even remember what the question was at that point. Like, they got to make decisions faster than that. So they're just going to make a decision because they didn't get the data fast enough. So that's really where you'll hear the pain, especially in the speed of getting what seems to them to be pretty simple. Like, count the number of this. I just need to know this count of a thing, right? So yeah, that's where you hear the pain the most.
Yeah, makes sense. There's a question here in the chat session. So for anybody listening in live, please feel free to drop in with your questions. Let us know where you're dialing in from, which company, and what your question is. So Lina asked a question: is there any particular techniques or tools for addressing the limitations of traditional dashboards that you come across that you found particularly effective? So driving the actionability aspect, for example.
That's a great question. There's some out there. I'm sure I don't know all of the ones that could be used, but for the actionability piece, I've avoided dashboards. I'll speak to like ways I've avoided them that people still use today, even like at various places. So instead of driving a dashboard, I really like one of the stops I would make. You can connect Snowflake into like Excel, for instance, right? So a lot of people want to just refresh some data on a report and have a report ready to go and then change some things with a pivot table. Like, let me drag in customers. Let me drag in now states or countries for those, right? They want to be able to pivot stuff. So an example of this really simple is make a pretty clean Snowflake table with, your customers, your sales, or whatever it might be, and provide an Excel connector to Snowflake for that stakeholder. And now they can just refresh their pivot table and adjust it as they need, right? They don't need to call you and say, hey, Nate, I need you to add in country as a filter into this dashboard. They can just do it in Excel, right? So there's other tools that emulate Excel and let you do it that way. So that's one way I've gotten around just building a dashboard. Say, here's some data, go pivot it, play with it. It's yours. You really understand it well. Another way is so at Smartsheet, I built a solution that for a sales rep, right, you have a book of accounts, 100 accounts or whatever it might be, depending on your company size, and all the different metrics about that company. You want to be able to then collaborate with people on that particular account. And so Smartsheet lets you do that. So I built a Smartsheet solution that took data and shows you're able to then work with your customers and figure out, work with your CS rep, and sales can work together on it. So I found ways to get it out of dashboards and into places where people can collaborate, like a Smartsheet, or there's other places you can do that, as well as somewhere like an Excel, where as an individual user, you can then find the data you need without going through a central data team. So there's ways to get out of dashboards only for getting data to folks.
Got it. So I think it's a good segue into Smartsheet now. So obviously, very different scale, large organization. Just kind of give a lay of the land a little bit in terms of the scale of the business and the role of and the different data teams that exist in the organization in different parts of the company from your prior experience.
Yeah, right. Because I just joined recently, about a week and a half ago. So I don't know necessarily what's happened in the past year. I'm catching up with a bunch of folks. It's been nice to see them. But in terms of the lay of the land, there's a central data team, which houses the data engineering team. When I was there, I managed the analytics engineering team. So the team enriching the data, making the source of truth kind of database world. There were some data analysts and data scientists who also helped out with that, right? So we had a bunch of folks on the central data team that were servicing much of the org. There's as well a pretty large team, about the same size, on the sales side. And this is where I started my time at Smartsheet, was on the sales analytics, kind of go-to-market side of things. So providing help specifically to the go-to-market team. And so those are the two largest teams. You have a central team managing the platform and helping with a lot of the teams across Smartsheet that aren't really, there's a little bit of support for sales, but since there's a sales analytics team, they're helping, product, marketing, finance, that side of things, as well as the sales analytics team. Then you have others that were popping up, right? Like people would be good at data, and you'd see someone on the product side who now is an analyst. You have, of course, on finance, there's various financial analysts that always exist. And are doing their work for the finance specific tasks. But you really have this mix of specialized analytics teams and the central kind of data team that's servicing the org in kind of a hub and spoke model. So it's pretty big, compared to Insightly, I was the only one doing all of that as much as I could as a single person. When you have a central data team as well as scattered ones, you have a little more scale you can hit. There's a lot more reach you can get throughout the company that way.
So Nate, this particular structure of a centralized data team that then supports analysts and individual business organizations, describe to us a little bit about how do the central teams build out the infrastructure to where the analysts can actually take advantage of it? What does that infrastructure look like? How's it different?
Yeah, so this is really where especially centralized data teams shine on the infrastructure side of things, right? This is something that if you're a sales analyst, you're not probably great at setting up ETL pipelines or like knowing the most cost-effective way to do that, or how do you set permissions up? Like I don't, if you're a sales analyst, I don't care about permissions for another team, right? So the essential data team is really handy on the infrastructure side, certainly like setting up governance and controls and reliability of it. So that's where that central data team, especially at Smartsheet, shines. And it's one where I helped build that analytics engineering team as well, that produce that really golden kind of curated data that other people in the company can use, right? Like the stakeholders for us were the other analysts. So this is where a central data team can build out that customer data set so that everyone's using that. If you're on finance, you're using it, sales, you're using it, marketing, whoever. And that got rid of the issue of people making their own customer data set with a slightly different definition, different dollars, and it'd be very confusing when different numbers would show up at higher levels of the company. So really shine on the standardization and infrastructure side of things is really where those central data teams are. And then at that point, that you have the analysts and data scientists who then partner with the different teams, right? Like you have the people helping with product and marketing and others. So they don't report into marketing, but they functionally do. Like they are in all the meetings with those folks. They go on site with them when they're in town, that kind of thing. So central data team, even though you're not on the marketing team as an analyst, you're still very much part of that team. That's really where I think the central data team shines, is when there's strategic partnership in that way.
Got it. Makes sense. And so in that kind of a organizational model, how do you define the data model? For example, like the customer data set that you described, right? So it's almost like the six blind men and the elephant, right? Like depending on which part you touch, you think of it in a different way. So different lines of businesses are looking at the same data, each has their own requirements around how they choose to extend the definition of the customer for, say, finance or CS or sales, et cetera. So how do you kind of manage the data modeling in that sort of an environment?
That's a good question. It's complicated. It's part of the answer. But the what we did is we understood, because those of us building this source of truth had been at Smartsheet for a while, so we kind of knew the general way that most people thought about a customer. For instance, there's other objects too, but for customer, we kind of knew what the general term of it was, and so we could use that as a definition. We knew that there were others out there, and so we needed to support that as well, right? Because finance might look at it a little bit differently because they have very specific reporting rules on what things are, right? So we allowed flexibility in there for letting you pull, like made it just, what we did is we made it transparent. Here's one definition of a customer, here's another. If we did another one, we can add that in too. But we tried to make it so that it was really obvious that you could pick between a couple of them, and it was transparent. We have documentation, right, that would tell you, here's what one means, here's what another means. Would people read documentation? I hope so. If not, it's okay. But we would try to document that as much as we could as well, right? But it was a lot of honestly talking to the business, going to sales saying, here's our definition of customer. Are we right on this? Go to marketing. Is this how you define that? Is there something we're missing? So that's been my strategy in data, almost no matter the role, including this one, is going and talking to the business instead of assuming. The more as a data team, if you're central and you assume you know what people want, I found you go wrong. Like you're off by a little bit, you have to redo work, and everybody's frustrated with wasted time. So that's really where the hard work was talking to people, setting up time on the calendar, making sure like, here's a report, is this what you'd expect, that kind of thing. So that's really where you figure out what people actually need in that database.
Got it. And in your previous stint with Smartsheet, when you started out, what was the state of the union as far as the data infrastructure and the technologies, et cetera?
When I first was there, you mean? Yeah. So it was just starting out with Snowflake. So Snowflake was pretty new. This is, I don't know, 6 years ago. So Snowflake was just starting to kind of creep into the market. And so there was a Snowflake database out there, and there was a central data team. At the time, I wasn't on the central data team. So this is interesting perspective. I eventually ended up there. I wasn't there. I was working with the sales team on building territories and sales forecasting, typical kind of sales operations tasks. So I knew there was Snowflake. I had to learn that technology. It wasn't that hard. If you've done some SQL before, you know Snowflake. And at that point, we were using Tableau for all of our visualization. So I was building things out in Excel or Tableau. But there wasn't a lot of tooling outside of that. I wasn't super technical yet. I didn't know how to set up my own data pipelines, that kind of thing, right? So there wasn't really tooling around that. And so as I would just pull my own stuff manually. That's really what actually drove me over into the BI team. It wasn't this specifically, but I wanted to be able to control that a bit more. And I thought, hey, there's an opportunity to go and build this out a bit. And that's what I eventually ended up doing, was for people like me on that sales analyst team, building out the tools so they could control their own world, right? Give them the tools to make their own tables, give them ability to create things in production that just didn't exist when I was first there. So at first it was a lot of ad hoc pulling. And by the time I left, we had built out a lot of the automated ways for analysts to build their own pipelines. Like that didn't exist. And it was a big change over those years.
Makes sense. And from a business standpoint, what was the problem? Like, what were some of the areas from a go-to-market standpoint that needed help with data? What problems you're trying to solve for them?
Yeah, a lot of it, especially so on the go-to-market side when I was working, it was around building out really functional territories for reps, right? So you have a lot of reps, you have a bunch of accounts that are growing at different rates, they're different sizes, they're in different parts of the world. So a lot of the questions that I helped out with, these are pretty major projects to build territories out, was to figure out like, how do you make it so that the accounts have the best chance to grow and the reps have the best, it's fair to the reps, right? You don't want to have it be kind of unfair to them. And so you have to balance this, like make sure the companies are set up to grow as well as make sure the territories are balanced. And so that's really that was one of the biggest challenges I was working on the sales side. The other one was this, and it sounds so funny, but I'll keep coming back to counting is hard, is you, as a rep, you'd have all these accounts, but you didn't have good visibility into them. Like you had to go to lots of different places to like find out like, what are they doing here? Like how active are they using the account? Like what stuff, like who on CS has talked to them? You had to go to different places for information. So we built out some pretty centralized dashboards in this case, and other spots where you could go to one account and see everything about that account. What are they using? What products have they bought? What have they bought in the past? Like who might you reach out to? Who has marketing reached out to in the last month? Like all those different questions about an account. That was another pretty big challenge. And a lot of that was counting. Like you're just trying to count stuff, but make it centralized so a rep could go to one place and not have to bounce around to old spreadsheets and wonder if the data was correct, right? So that was another piece of just making some data visible in one spot that wasn't really before.
Got it. And from a rep's perspective or anybody kind of in the field organization, how did they get access to the counts or analysis that you were putting together? Was it through their CRM tool? Was it through dashboards? Was it something else? What was their experience like?
Yeah, and there was a few different spots, but we tried to make it so that it was logical where you would go for different pieces of information. So information that was best housed in Salesforce, you go there like around your pipelines and things like that. Like, hey, you can go here. Like that's a Salesforce thing. Like go hop into that. Other than that, it was largely in Tableau for that central data world about my particular account, what's going on with it. There's a lot of other reports in Tableau, but that's an example. And we had a Smartsheet solution I mentioned a little earlier in the call where you could go and see your book of accounts and then collaborate with like your CS rep or other reps on, setting strategy, flag accounts that are up for renewal this quarter, all that kind of stuff that you want to do in a more collaborative way. So different spots for different use cases that depended on what they wanted to do, but it was, 2 or 3 spots you go to.
Got it. So Nate, one of the, we did a bunch of research as we were starting out Immersa a few years back. And we talked to a number of sales reps, CROs, heads of CSMs, et cetera. We still do all the time. And one of the challenges we found is the number of different places that they have to turn to get a understanding of what is going on in their account. So, the data in Salesforce might be different from Gainsight, or the data in, Bong or Clary or any of the tools, dozens of tools that surround Salesforce today might have one perspective on what's going on in the account, but when you look at it, in a Tableau dashboard, it might be different. So, do you see that as a challenge in the industry? Like, how so from a data team's perspective, what are some of the things that can be done differently to address that?
Yeah, and this is spot on for what I was thinking a lot about, especially at Insightly, is I didn't want to become like the dashboard builder, right? This is the dashboard trap we talked about a little bit. So a lot of times what you don't want to do is have people drag up and out of where they were and have to go find a dashboard somewhere, have to go find data in a spreadsheet somewhere, that kind of thing, right? So I am very convinced that as we mature as data workers, that we find ways to get data to the person who needs it in the context that they need it, right? So instead of pulling them out, it should be in Salesforce somewhere. But not only that, there should be a recommended action of some kind. I think is really the key to this, right? Like, a lot of times when especially if you're rolling out something at scale, me as a single person, like at Insightly, I could go to every single rep if I wanted to and make sure they knew how to use the thing that I built. So that makes it pretty effective, right? But it's not scalable. I can't keep doing that or have data teams spending all their time training, right? So making it so that the perfect example is I'm a rep or a CS, let's go with CS rep. I want a list of all my accounts. Tell me which ones are likely to churn. Which one should I call? Like make that really obvious. Show it in the CRM. Let me just pull up my report in the CRM and show it there, or a dashboard. I don't really care where I go. CRM's preferable, but tell me what to do. Should I call them? Are they going to churn on one product? Are we talking all of them, right? So I think this is really driving action inside the context of the tool that they most use. For CS, it's Gainsight might be an example of that, right? Like you're using that tool. For sales might be the CRM, or maybe it's both. But driving data out of dashboards and into the places where people are operating, I think is where the future of really effective data work is going, where I think really effective data teams operate.
Got it. Very helpful. I kind of want to go back a little bit into the world of Snowflake and dbt and Fivetran and all those different tools.
Yeah.
When we started out this conversation, you mentioned that some of the challenges that you found from a data standpoint are around data quality and how to find the data, because it exists in multiple locations typically in any, even like a small company, you might have multiple data sources. What are some of the other challenges associated with bringing all that data together into Snowflake to do that? What else what are some of the other issues and landmines that data analysts kind of need to keep in mind before they start operating and working on a project?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of it is once you get data in, you have to then essentially resolve, like figure out the resolution of your things in terms of you have a customers, right? So you have sales loft, let's say, right? Or outreach where you have different calls and emails coming in. So essentially resolving everything into one customer world is not easy to do because you have different grains of stuff. You have a bunch of emails and calls here. You have your NetSuite transactions over here. Figure out how to turn that into a report, part of the customer table. You have product usage you got to bring in and then munge all the product data, which can be quite complex. There can be a lot of it. That's not really shaped for analytics. So for analysts, this is really, if you haven't built out a data pipeline like this, you have to be very purposeful about it, I think is the biggest piece. So, and I learned a lot of this at Smartsheet, building out that data source of truth, is we had to sit down and before we built anything, right? We had to think for a long time about how do we structure this so that it's flexible. Like if we bring in another data source, how does it bring that in? When there's an error, how do I know about it? When there's a problem in something, how do we fix it quickly? Let's not make it brittle. Let's make it so that things aren't stacked on top of each other like a house of cards, right? So you have to build kind of a scalable way to turn that raw data into stuff the business uses and make it obvious where things might break and so kind of where those are. So that's thinking in scale is not something that's super normal for analysts. So that's the piece, especially if you haven't worked on a big database, that you kind of have to work through the scale of like, how do I make it so that this doesn't break, that kind of thing. So I think that's really where it is, where the main focus is for folks on bigger teams.
Got it. Okay. And then any, in terms of like tooling and sort of the tools that are required to figure that out, any advice on that in terms, besides Snowflake and Fivetran and dbt, which everybody sort of has glommed onto as part of the modern data stack? What are some of the other nuances to be aware of from a data quality standpoint, scaling, et cetera? Like any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll give this. This is a trap I've seen that we've had to unwind for data teams, especially if you don't plan out your platform before people start building things out. So a really common trap is this. Tableau or Hex or Power BI or whatever it is, give you a lot of abilities and analysts to take tables and then combine them together and build a thing like a new table, right? That a dashboard sits on top of, right? So you run some SQL in Tableau, you can run it nightly, like schedule a nightly run of something. So what can happen is data can get trapped in your BI layer. Like business logic is what I mean by this, right? So you say, well, commissions are calculated with this, this, and this, and you build out a formula, let's say in Tableau, right? Well, if that changes now, let's say commissions are changed every year, right? So now you got to redo it. It's really obvious in your dbt project on Get, you can look up and figure out where's our commissions table. Let's change the logic there. If you have logic sitting in Tableau somewhere, it's almost impossible to know that that'll break, that it won't be accurate. Like that commissions report you made 6 months ago, you're not gonna remember anything about it. It's gonna break now, it's not gonna be right. So this is one of those big traps with technology that folks can get lost inside of, is business logic ending up where you don't want it, where then it's duplicated right now. Now commissions might be calculated in 2 different dashboards because it didn't exist. So bringing pieces into those layers earlier on, I think is as when you think about a technology stack, put the data where it should be and leverage it with the tools that it should be leveraged with is really the piece of it. There's all sorts of traps is more or less what I'm trying to say.
Gotcha.
And you can end up with those in Tableau or elsewhere.
Got it. That's really good advice. I think it's going to be very valuable for a lot of people listening in. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned product data earlier on as one of the data sources in sort of taking into consideration all the things that you have to bring in. Are there some unique challenges around product data that you've encountered that are worth talking about here?
Yeah,
So product data is unique in many ways. One of the biggest challenges is this is engineering teams are shipping features and they do not want to, nor should they take a dependence on the data team, right? So if the product team is shipping a new feature and that changes the schema of a table that the data team's using, or maybe how they're recording a particular column changes all of a sudden, the data team has to deal with that. And you don't want to slow down the engineering team shipping product features for customers because the data team has to catch up to that. So there's a lot of friction there that can happen, honestly, between product and data, because the data team's trying to then take that product data and give it to the business about who's using what features and what customers are using what. And the challenge there is always staying in lockstep with the engineering team. And it's much easier said than done, but knowing what changes are coming, how does that impact the data that we receive into Snowflake? Are we even going to get the data? Like, do we need to set up a new pipeline? These kind of questions can get dropped and you can end up with something shipped that you can't give any analytics to. Like everyone's asking, the CPO says, what's this? Like, how are people using it? And we have to say, I don't know. We have to go like to the actual production database somewhere, right? So I think that's the biggest piece. The biggest challenge I've seen is that. There's other pieces to it, but staying in lockstep with product is much, much easier said than done.
Yeah, got it. This has been a fantastic session, Nate. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate the breadth of what you covered here today is fantastic, and a lot of learning for me as I listen to you, and I'm sure for others as well as they watch this show afterwards. For those of you watching, thank you for joining us. We will have the session available to you in your inbox by the end of the day today, and please do share it with your colleagues and on social media to anybody who might be interested in it. We're going to take a break next week from our webinar series and come back the following week with another exciting guest. So thank you for joining us today. Nate, if you don't mind, please stay on for a few more minutes and we'll wrap up in just a few.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on.